Welcome to Sleepless Survivors. Tonight, we journey to the crown of our world, where ice meets mystery and where ancient peoples carved their existence from the frozen wilderness. Close your eyes, settle into comfort, and let us drift together into the story of the forgotten civilizations of the North Pole. The Arctic night is eternal in winter. For months the sun never rises above the horizon, leaving the world in a twilight that seems to exist outside of time itself. It is here, in this realm of perpetual darkness and cold, that human beings have lived for thousands of years, not just survived, but thrived, built cultures, developed technologies, created art and music and stories that echoed across the ice. Imagine standing on the frozen tundra as darkness settles in for the season. The temperature drops to 40 below zero. The wind carries tiny crystals of ice that sparkle in the light of the aurora borealis dancing overhead. This is a place that seems hostile to life itself. And yet, people have called this home since time immemorial. The civilizations of the far north are not lost in the way that ancient Rome or Egypt are lost. Their descendants still live in the Arctic today. But the old ways, the ancient knowledge, the civilizations that existed before contact with the outside world, these are fading into memory, recorded only in archaeological remains and oral traditions passed down through generations. Let us begin our journey at the top of the world, where the ice cap floats on the Arctic Ocean, and work our way south through the lands that ring this frozen sea. We will meet peoples who hunted whales from skin boats, who built houses from snow, who navigated thousands of miles of trackless ice, using only their knowledge of the stars and the subtle signs written in the landscape. The Thule people emerged around 1,000 years ago in Alaska, and rapidly spread eastward across the Arctic, reaching Greenland within 2 centuries. They were the ancestors of the modern Inuit, and they brought with them a sophisticated culture adapted to Arctic survival. The Thule were master hunters of sea mammals, particularly the bowhead whale, which could provide food, fuel and materials to sustain an entire community through the long winter. Picture a Thule settlement on a windswept coast. The houses are partially underground, their walls built from stone and whalebone, covered with layers of sod for insulation. Inside, a lamp burns seal oil, providing both light and warmth. The flame is carefully tended, its brightness adjusted by raising or lowering the wick, which is made from Arctic cotton or moss. This single flame can keep the interior of the house surprisingly warm, even when the outside temperature is deadly cold. The people inside wear clothing made from caribou hide and sealskin. Every piece is carefully sewn with sinew thread. The stitch is so tight that they are waterproof. The clothing is designed in layers, with air trapped between them for insulation. The outer layer has the fur facing outward to shed snow and ice. The inner layer has the fur facing inward for warmth. This is technology that modern outdoor clothing manufacturers still struggle to match. Outside the house, cached in the permafrost, is food. Hundreds of pounds of whale meat and blubber, seal meat, walrus, Arctic char, caribou. The cold is not an enemy, but a tool. A natural freezer that keeps food fresh for months. The Thule understood the Arctic in ways that outsiders never could. They knew which ice was safe to walk on, and which would break beneath their weight. They knew how to read the sky, to predict storms days in advance. They knew where the animals would be and when. Their boats were marvels of engineering. The Umiak, a large open boat, could carry an entire family and all their possessions. The frame was made from driftwood, carefully lashed together with baleen, the flexible material from the mouths of whales. The covering was made from seal or walrus hide, sewn together and stretched tight over the frame. The result was a vessel that was light enough to be carried, flexible enough to survive impacts with ice, and strong enough to hunt whales in the open ocean. The kayak was smaller, designed for a single hunter. It was fast and manoeuvrable, essentially waterproof when the hunter wore his specially designed parka that tied around the opening of the cockpit. A skilled kayaker could roll completely upside down and right himself again, a technique that was known to the Thule long before it was discovered by European kayakers in the 20th century. But the Thule were not the first people in the Arctic. They were preceded by others, cultures that archaeologists have given names like the Dorset, the Pre-Dorset, and the Independence cultures. These earlier peoples adapted to the Arctic in different ways, with different technologies and different strategies for survival. The Dorset culture emerged around 2,500 years ago and lasted until about 1,000 years ago, when they were displaced by the Thule. The Dorset people did not use dogs or kayaks. They hunted seals by waiting at breathing holes in the ice, sometimes standing motionless for hours in temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. They made beautiful carvings from ivory and bone, small figurines that may have had spiritual significance. Many of these carvings depict faces with mysterious expressions, eyes closed or partially open, as if sleeping or in trance. The Dorset built snow houses, but they also constructed more permanent dwellings from stone. Some of their sites show evidence of structures that were used for generations, suggesting a less nomadic lifestyle than the Thule who came after them. They made tools from stone, bone, and ivory, but no one knows exactly why they did not adopt the bow and arrow, which was known to peoples to their south. Perhaps they did not need it. Perhaps their hunting methods were so effective that the technology was unnecessary. One of the most intriguing aspects of Dorset culture is their art. They created tiny, exquisitely detailed carvings that show bears, birds, and humans. Some of these carvings have holes drilled through them, suggesting they were worn as amulets. Many show a level of artistic skill that rivals anything produced in more temperate regions during the same time period. When you hold one of these carvings, small enough to fit in the palm of your hand, you're holding something that was precious to someone 1,000 years ago, carried with them across the ice, important enough to take up precious weight in their possessions. Before the Dorset were the pre-Dorset, who arrived in the Arctic around 4,000 years ago. These people spread rapidly across the Arctic from Alaska to Greenland in a surprisingly short time. They were highly mobile, following caribou herds in summer and hunting sea mammals in winter. Their tools show a sophistication in working stone that speaks to generations of accumulated knowledge. Even earlier, the independence cultures lived in the high Arctic beginning around 4,500 years ago. These were among the first people to live year-round in the Arctic, and they did so in some of the most extreme conditions on Earth. The northern coast of Greenland, where many independence sites have been found, is one of the coldest places humans have ever permanently inhabited. How they survived is still not fully understood. Archaeological sites from these early cultures are scattered across the Arctic, often covered by ice or vegetation, slowly being revealed as the climate changes. Each site tells a story. A circle of stones marks where a tent once stood. A line of stones across a valley shows where people drove caribou for the hunt. A beach littered with ancient bone fragments shows where generations of people processed seals and walruses, but the civilizations of the North Pole region extend beyond the peoples of the ice. Around the margins of the Arctic are other cultures with their own rich histories. The Sami people of northern Scandinavia and Russia have lived in the region for thousands of years. Unlike the Inuit cultures, which focused heavily on marine mammals, the Sami developed a way of life centered on reindeer herding. The origins of the Sami are lost in prehistory, but genetic and linguistic evidence suggests they have been in northern Europe since at least the end of the last ice age. They speak languages from the Uralic family, related to Finnish and Hungarian but distinct. They developed a semi-nomadic lifestyle following reindeer herds on seasonal migrations, living in temporary structures called lavu, which are similar to tepees. Reindeer provided everything the Sami needed: meat for food, hide for clothing and shelter, sinew for thread, bone and antler for tools. Even the contents of the reindeer's stomach, partially digested lichen, was used as a food in times of scarcity. The relationship between the Sami and the reindeer was so close that the Sami language has hundreds of words to describe different types of reindeer, different colours, different ages, different behaviours. The Sami were expert craftspeople. They worked wood, bone and metal with equal skill. They made beautiful knives with decorated handles and elaborately patterned sheaths. They created jewellery from silver and pewter, often featuring traditional motifs that had been passed down for generations. They wove clothing from wool and decorated it with colourful ribbons and beadwork. But perhaps most importantly, the Sami were storytellers. Their oral tradition preserved history, morality and practical knowledge in the form of stories and songs. The joik, a traditional form of Sami music, is one of the oldest continuous musical traditions in Europe. A joik is not a song about something, but a song that embodies its subject. There are joiks for specific people, for places, for animals, for moods. To joik is to capture the essence of something in sound. The Sami had a rich spiritual tradition that saw the world as full of living spirits. Every mountain, every river, every forest had its guardian spirit that needed to be respected. The Noaidi, or shaman, was a central figure in Sami society, someone who could enter trance states and communicate with the spirit world. The Noaidi used a sacred drum, beautifully decorated with symbols, to enter these states. The drum would be beaten rhythmically while the Noaidi chanted, their consciousness travelling to other realms to seek knowledge or healing. Like many indigenous Arctic peoples, the Sami faced tremendous pressure from the dominant cultures around them. For centuries, they were subject to forced conversion, cultural suppression, and displacement from their traditional lands. The old knowledge was actively suppressed, the drums burned, the Noaidis persecuted. Much was lost, but much also survived, passed down in secret, preserved in memories and practiced in hidden places. On the other side of the Arctic, in what is now Russia, other peoples developed their own unique civilizations adapted to the extreme north. The Nenets, the Chukchi, the Evenks, and others each developed distinct cultures, languages, and ways of understanding the world. The Nenets are reindeer herders of the western Siberian tundra. They live a nomadic life that has changed remarkably little over thousands of years. They migrate with their herds, travelling hundreds of miles each year between summer and winter pastures. They live in chums, conical tents covered with reindeer hide, which can be taken down and packed in less than an hour. The Nenets year is structured around the needs of the reindeer. In spring they move north to the coast, where the reindeer give birth to their calves and where mosquitoes are less troublesome. In fall they move south again to the forests, where the reindeer can find food through the winter by digging through the snow to reach the lichen underneath. This migration has been happening for so long that there are traditional routes, traditional camping places, traditional landmarks that are known to every Nenet's child. The relationship between the Nenets and their reindeer is complex. The reindeer are not domesticated in the way that cattle or sheep are domesticated. They are semi-wild, choosing to stay with the herders but capable of surviving on their own. The herders must know each animal individually, must know which are reliable and which are stubborn, which are good mothers and which are likely to wander. A successful herder might have a herd of several hundred animals, each one known by sight. Further east, the Chukchi people developed a culture adapted to the extreme conditions of the northeast Siberian coast. The Chukchi are traditionally divided into two groups: the reindeer Chukchi, who lived an inland nomadic life similar to the Nenets, and the maritime Chukchi, who settled on the coast and hunted sea mammals. The maritime Chukchi were expert whale hunters. They hunted grey whales, bowhead whales, and belugas from skin boats similar to the Umiaks of the Inuit. Whale hunting was dangerous work. The boats would approach the whale from behind, and a harpooner would strike it with a harpoon tipped with stone or later iron. The harpoon was attached to inflated seal skins that would tire the whale as it tried to dive. The hunt could last for hours, with multiple boats working together to finally kill the whale and tow it to shore. When a whale was caught, it was cause for celebration. The entire community would gather to butcher the animal, a process that could take days. Every part of the whale was used. The meat and blubber were food. The bones were used for construction and tools. The baleen was used for lashing and for making various implements. The intestines were cleaned and used to make waterproof clothing. Nothing was wasted because waste meant death in a land where resources were scarce. The Chukchi had a reputation as fierce warriors who successfully resisted Russian conquest for much longer than most Siberian peoples. They fought Russian forces to a standstill in the 18th century, and while they eventually came under Russian control, they were never truly conquered. They retained much of their traditional autonomy and their traditional way of life well into the 20th century. All of these Arctic peoples developed sophisticated technologies for surviving in their environment, but they also developed complex social structures, rich artistic traditions, and deep spiritual beliefs. The Arctic was not a blank wasteland to them, but a living, meaningful place filled with stories and spirits and memories. Consider the Inukshuk, stone cairns built by Inuit people across the Arctic. To an outsider, they might seem like simple piles of rocks, but each one has a purpose. Some mark good hunting, or fishing locations. Some serve as navigational aids, allowing people to find their way across trackless terrain. Some are built in the shape of a person with outstretched arms, and these were used in caribou hunting. The caribou, seeing these stone figures and mistaking them for humans, would be funneled into areas where hunters waited. These stone cairns last for centuries, even millennia. Some of the Inukshuk standing in the Arctic today were built so long ago that no one remembers who built them, or exactly when. They are a physical connection to the past, a reminder that people have been living in and understanding this landscape far longer than recorded history extends. The same is true of the ancient dwelling sites scattered across the Arctic. At many locations, you can see circles of stones that once held down the edges of tents. You can see the remains of food caches, stone structures where meat was stored to protect it from animals. You can see the spots where stone tools were made, the ground still littered with flakes of stone struck off thousands of years ago. These sites are quiet now, empty of people, but if you sit still and let your mind wander, you can almost hear the sounds that once filled these places. The voices of children playing, the scrape of a stone blade against hide, the wind flapping against tent walls, the crackle of a fire. These were not just survival camps, but homes, places where families lived and loved and argued and made peace, where stories were told and songs were sung. The oral traditions of Arctic peoples preserve memories that go back incredibly far. Stories tell of times when the glaciers still covered the land, when the sea was lower and you could walk to places that are now islands. Stories tell of volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, of changes in animal populations, of wars and migrations and great hunters and powerful shamans. For a long time, outsiders dismissed these stories as myths, as entertaining fictions with no basis in fact. But as archaeological and geological evidence has accumulated, many of these stories have been validated. The land was indeed different in the past. The sea level was indeed lower. There were indeed major geological events that matched the events described in stories. This suggests that these oral traditions are preserving genuine historical memories, passed down from generation to generation for thousands of years. The story itself might change in small ways with each telling, but the core memory remains. This is cultural technology, a way of preserving information without writing, and it is remarkably effective when practiced by a culture that values accuracy in storytelling. The Arctic peoples also preserved practical knowledge through oral tradition, how to read the weather from the colour of the sky, where to find good stone for making tools, which plants can be eaten and which are poisonous, how to navigate using the stars, the wind, the direction of snowdrifts. This knowledge was necessary for survival, and its loss could mean death. When outsiders first encountered Arctic peoples, they often marvelled at how these people could survive in such a harsh environment. But the Arctic peoples did not see their homeland as particularly harsh. It was simply home, the place they knew, the place that made sense. The rest of the world, with its heat and its diseases and its strange customs, seemed far more foreign and threatening than the familiar cold of the north. The first contacts between Arctic peoples and outsiders were often through trade. Norse Vikings settled in Greenland in the 10th century and traded with the Dorset and later Thule peoples. Archaeological evidence shows Norse artifacts in Inuit sites and Inuit artifacts in Norse sites. The two groups traded peacefully for a time, though the relationship may not have always been friendly. The Norse called the indigenous people they encountered Skrellings, a term that might mean wretches, or might simply mean people who wear hides. The Norse sagas mention encounters with Skrellings, describing them as fierce warriors who used skin boats and lived in the far north. Some encounters were peaceful, with trade in ivory, hides and iron. Other encounters were violent, with raids and battles. The Norse settlements in Greenland lasted for almost 500 years before they were abandoned in the 15th century. No one knows exactly why they failed. Climate change may have made farming impossible. Trade routes back to Europe may have been disrupted. Disease may have decimated the population. Or perhaps conflict with the Thule people, who were expanding eastward at this time, made the settlements untenable. The Thule had superior cold weather technology, and could survive in conditions that would kill the Norse. When European explorers began venturing into the Arctic in the 16th and 17th centuries, they encountered Inuit people all along the coasts. These encounters were often difficult. The Europeans wanted to find the Northwest Passage, a sea route through the Arctic to Asia. They saw the Arctic as an obstacle to be overcome, not a home. The Inuit saw these strange ships and strange people, with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Some of these early encounters went badly. Europeans took Inuit people as captives, displaying them in European cities as curiosities. Inuit people raided European ships for iron, which was incredibly valuable in a land with no local sources of metal. Europeans sometimes responded to these raids with violence. Diseases carried by Europeans to which Arctic peoples had no immunity, swept through communities killing thousands. But there were also positive encounters. Some Europeans learned from the Inuit, adopting their clothing and their survival strategies. Without Inuit help, many early Arctic expeditions would have ended in complete disaster. The Inuit knew how to build snow houses for shelter, how to hunt seals, for food, how to prevent frostbite and snow blindness. They shared this knowledge with the Europeans, often saving their lives. As European presence in the Arctic increased, the traditional way of life began to change. Fur trading became important, with Arctic peoples trading furs for metal tools, guns, and other goods. Christian missionaries arrived, working to convert the people and suppress traditional spiritual practices. Governments imposed control, drawing borders across traditional territories, requiring people to settle in permanent communities, taking children away to residential schools where they were forbidden to speak their own languages. The impact of these changes cannot be overstated. Within a few generations, much of the old knowledge was lost. Languages began to die out as children were taught only in English, Danish, Russian, or other colonial languages. Traditional skills were forgotten as people became dependent on imported goods. Spiritual practices were abandoned or practiced in secret. The social fabric of communities was torn apart, and yet much survived. People continued to hunt and fish. They continued to tell stories. They continued to make art. They adapted to the new world while trying to hold on to what was essential from the old. Today, there is a renaissance of indigenous Arctic culture, with people working to revive languages, to learn traditional skills, to reconnect with the land and the old ways. Let us return to the ice and think about what it means to live in a place where the temperature can drop to 70 below zero, where the sun does not rise for months at a time, where the landscape is white in every direction as far as the eye can see. How does a person maintain their sanity in such an environment? How do they maintain their humanity? The answer is community. In the Arctic, survival depends on cooperation. One person alone will die, a family might struggle, but a community can thrive. This necessity created cultures that placed high value on sharing, on cooperation, on the welfare of the group over the individual. When a hunter killed a seal, the meat was shared according to traditional rules. The person who first spotted the seal got a share. The person who made the harpoon got a share. The person who owned the boat got a share. The hunter's family got a share. But everyone in the community got something. No one went hungry while others feasted. This ethic of sharing extended to everything. If someone needed clothing, others would help make it. If someone needed tools, others would provide materials. If someone was sick, others would care for them. If someone died, others would care for their family. The community was a web of mutual obligation, everyone depending on everyone else. This created societies that were remarkably egalitarian. There were no kings or chiefs with absolute power. Leaders emerged based on their skill and their generosity, but they had no power to compel others. Decisions were made by consensus, with everyone having a voice. Arguments were settled through discussion, or through song duels where the disputants would mock each other in verse, until everyone laughed and the tension was broken. Life in the Arctic required patience. A hunter might wait for hours at a seal's breathing hole, standing perfectly still in the freezing cold, waiting for the brief moment when the seal surfaced to breathe. A person making clothing might spend days carefully sewing each piece, knowing that a single badly sewn seam could let in water and lead to death from hypothermia. A person navigating across the ice might travel for weeks, carefully observing the terrain, making sure of each step. This patience extended to child rearing. Arctic peoples rarely punished children. Instead, they taught through example and through stories. A child who was misbehaving might be told a story about what happened to someone who behaved that way. The child was expected to learn from the story, to understand the lesson without being directly scolded. This created individuals who were self-reliant and thoughtful, who understood the consequences of their actions. The Arctic also required flexibility. Conditions could change rapidly. A storm could blow up in minutes, reducing visibility to nothing. Ice that was solid could suddenly break apart. Animals that were plentiful one year might be scarce the next. Survival required the ability to adapt, to change plans, to make do with what was available. This created cultures that were pragmatic rather than dogmatic. Rules were guidelines, not absolutes. If a rule did not make sense in a particular situation, it could be bent or broken. What mattered was survival, not adherence to principle. This pragmatism sometimes confused outsiders who were used to more rigid social structures, but beneath the pragmatism was a deep spirituality. The Arctic peoples believed that everything had a soul. Every animal, every rock, every place. The universe was alive, filled with consciousness and intention. Humans were not separate from nature, but part of it, one type of being among many. This worldview required respect. Before killing an animal, a hunter would apologize to it, explaining that his family needed food. After killing an animal, the hunter would perform certain rituals to honor the animal's spirit and ensure it would be willing to be caught again. A woman sewing a sealskin parka would talk to the skin, thanking the seal for giving its life and promising to make good use of the gift. This respect extended to the land itself. Certain places were sacred, inhabited by powerful spirits. These places were to be approached with caution, with offerings made and proper protocols followed. To violate these places was to invite disaster, not just for the individual but for the entire community. The shamans, the people who could communicate directly with the spirit world, were central to Arctic religious life. Through their training and their natural gifts, they could enter trance states and journey to other realms. They could see what was hidden, speak to the dead, negotiate with the spirits of animals to ensure good hunting. Becoming a shaman was not easy. It often involved a crisis, a period of madness or illness during which the person died and was reborn with new powers. The training could take years, learning the songs and the techniques, learning to control the trance state, learning to interpret visions. Not everyone who began the training completed it. Some died, some went mad, some simply realized they did not have the necessary gifts. A shaman's power came with responsibilities. They were expected to use their gifts for the benefit of the community, to find game when hunting was poor, to heal the sick, to divine the future. But they were also feared, because the same power that could heal could also harm. A shaman who was offended might curse you. A shaman who was evil might steal souls or send sickness. The trance journeys of the shamans were real experiences to the people who went through them. The shaman would beat a drum, entering a rhythmic state of consciousness that opened doorways to other worlds. They would travel beneath the sea to negotiate with Sedna, the mother of sea mammals, to release her children for the hunters. They would fly through the air to distant lands to find lost souls. They would battle malevolent spirits that were causing illness. These journeys were described in vivid detail. The shaman would tell of what they saw, the beings they encountered, the bargains they made. The community would listen, believing because they had seen the evidence of the shaman's power. The sick person had been healed. The hunting had improved. The lost child had been found. Modern science might explain these experiences differently, talking about altered states of consciousness, about the power of suggestion, about how the mind can create vivid hallucinations. But to reduce these experiences to mere neurochemistry misses something important. For the people involved, these journeys were real, the spirits were real, the power was real, and in their context, within their worldview, this made perfect sense. One of the most fascinating aspects of Arctic spirituality is the concept of soul. For many Arctic peoples, every person had multiple souls. One soul was the breath soul, which animated the body. Another was the name soul, carried in the name and passed from one person to another. When a child was born, they were often given the name of a recently deceased relative, and it was believed that some essence of that person lived on in the child. This created interesting family dynamics. A child might be treated as a partial reincarnation of the person whose name they carried. They might be spoken to as if they were that person. They might be expected to have some of the characteristics of that person, but they were also their own individual, developing their own personality and identity. Death was not an ending, but a transition. The soul would leave the body and travel to the land of the dead, which was often described as being much like the land of the living, only better. There was always good hunting in the land of the dead. It was never cold. There was no hunger, no pain, no sorrow. The dead would wait there until they were ready to be reborn, returning to the world in a new body, often to their own family. This belief in reincarnation meant that death was less frightening than it might otherwise be. You were not losing someone forever. They were simply going away for a while before returning. This made grief more bearable, though it certainly did not eliminate it. The loss was still real. The absence was still painful. But there was hope of reunion. Arctic funeral practices varied widely. but they often involved placing the body on the ground in a remote location, sometimes with grave goods, sometimes wrapped in hides or enclosed in a stone cairn. The body was left to return to the earth, to feed the animals, to become part of the cycle of life and death that sustained everything. Graves were often marked so that people could find them again, could come to leave offerings or to speak to the dead. Some graves have survived for thousands of years, protected by the permafrost. When archaeologists excavate these graves, they find astonishing preservation. Bodies still have skin and hair. Clothing is intact. Wooden and leather objects, which would decay rapidly in warmer climates, are perfectly preserved. These graves provide an incredible window into the past, showing us exactly what people wore, what tools they used, how they buried their dead. But these excavations are controversial. Many indigenous people object to the disturbance of ancestral graves. From their perspective, these are not archaeological specimens, but ancestors who deserve respect. The fact that scientists want to study the bodies does not give them the right to disturb the rest of the dead. This is part of a larger conflict between indigenous peoples and the scientific establishment, a conflict over who has the right to tell the story of the past. The history of the Arctic is not just the history of indigenous peoples. It is also the history of the explorers, the whalers, the traders, the miners, and all the other outsiders who came to the north seeking profit or glory. Many of these people brought destruction with them, but some brought genuine respect and curiosity, a desire to understand rather than to exploit. The age of Arctic exploration in the 19th and early 20th centuries brought many outsiders to the far north. Some were seeking the Northwest Passage, others were trying to reach the North Pole itself. These expeditions often ended in disaster. Ships were crushed in the ice. Men died from cold, from scurvy, from starvation. The Arctic was unforgiving to those who did not respect it. The most famous disaster was the Franklin expedition of 1845. Two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, set out to navigate the Northwest Passage. They were last seen by Europeans in Baffin Bay. Then they vanished. For years, no one knew what happened to them. Search expeditions found scattered remains and heard stories from Inuit people about white men starving in the ice, but the ships themselves remained lost. The Inuit told of seeing the ships trapped in the ice, of finding abandoned camps with dead men, of a last desperate march southward by the survivors. They told of men who were starving despite being surrounded by animals, men who did not know how to hunt seals or how to build shelters from snow. The Inuit tried to help when they could, but many of the sailors were too proud to accept help from people they considered savages. For over a century and a half, the Franklin ships remained lost. Then, in 2014 and 2016, they were finally discovered, remarkably well preserved on the ocean floor. The wrecks confirmed much of what the Inuit oral tradition had been saying all along. The ships had been trapped in the ice. The crews had abandoned them and tried to walk to safety. They had failed. This is a pattern that repeats throughout the history of Arctic exploration. Outsiders came with the latest technology, confident in their superiority, and died because they did not listen to indigenous knowledge. Meanwhile, the indigenous people, using technology that looked primitive to European eyes, thrived in the same conditions. The technology that Arctic peoples developed was the result of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. Every detail of their clothing, their tools, their hunting methods had been refined over countless generations. What looked simple was actually highly sophisticated, optimized for its purpose in ways that modern technology still struggles to match. Consider the snow house, the igloo. To someone unfamiliar with its construction, it might seem miraculous that you can build a warm shelter from blocks of snow. But the principle is simple. Snow is mostly air, and air is an excellent insulator. By packing snow into dense blocks and building a dome shape, you create a structure that is strong, windproof, and insulating. A small fire or lamp inside can raise the interior temperature to above freezing, even when it is 50 below outside. But knowing the principle is different from being able to actually build an igloo. The blocks must be cut from snow of the right consistency, not too soft and not too hard. They must be shaped correctly, with each block leaning inward at the right angle. The dome must be constructed so that it supports itself, with the final keystone block locking everything in place. This is a skill that takes practice to master, but a skilled builder can construct a shelter in under an hour. Or consider the kayak, which we mentioned earlier. The design of a kayak is the result of centuries of refinement. The length, the width, the shape of the hull, the placement of the cockpit, every element is optimized for stability, speed, and maneuverability in icy waters. Modern kayak designers use computer modelling and hydrodynamic testing to create their designs. Arctic peoples did the same optimization through trial and error over many generations. The harpoon is another example of sophisticated design. A successful harpoon must penetrate the thick hide of a seal or walrus, must lodge securely so the animal cannot escape, and must be attached to a line so the hunter can retrieve the catch. Arctic harpoons accomplished all this with elegance. The head was designed to toggle sideways once it entered the body, making it nearly impossible for the animal to pull free. The line was elastic enough to absorb the shock when the animal tried to escape, but strong enough not to break. The shaft was carefully balanced so it would fly true. Every culture develops technologies appropriate to its environment. In the Arctic, where resources were limited and mistakes could be fatal, the technology had to be right. There was no room for error, no tolerance for waste. This created a culture of craftsmanship, where people took pride in making things perfectly, where quality was a matter of survival. This same perfectionism extended to artistic pursuits. Arctic peoples created beautiful objects not just for practical use, but for aesthetic pleasure. Clothing was decorated with elaborate patterns. Tools were carved with intricate designs. Drums and other ritual objects were covered with meaningful symbols. This was art that was integrated into daily life, not separated into galleries and museums. The patterns and symbols used in Arctic art were not arbitrary. They carried meaning, told stories, conveyed information. A particular pattern on a parka might indicate which community the wearer was from. A carving on a tool might depict the animal the tool was designed to hunt. A drum painting might map the shaman's spirit world. To someone who knew how to read these symbols, objects were texts, full of information. Much of this symbolic language has been lost. When elders die without passing on their knowledge, the meanings die with them. A new generation might know that a pattern is traditional, might know how to replicate it, but not know what it originally meant. This is one of the tragedies of cultural disruption, that meaning is lost even when form is preserved. But there is hope. Across the Arctic, there are efforts to preserve and revitalize traditional knowledge. Elders work with younger people, teaching languages, teaching skills, telling stories. Museums return artifacts to communities so that people can study them and learn from them. Governments, after decades of suppression, now support indigenous culture. This revitalization is not about recreating the past exactly as it was. The world has changed, and Arctic peoples have changed with it. No, one wants to give up modern medicine or modern communication technology. But there is a recognition that the old ways have value, that the knowledge accumulated over thousands of years is worth preserving, that cultural identity matters. Young people are learning to hunt with their grandfathers, learning to read the ice, learning the old stories. Artists are creating new works that blend traditional forms with contemporary themes. Writers are publishing books in indigenous languages, creating literature where none existed before. This is a living culture, adapting and evolving but rooted in ancient tradition. The Arctic itself is changing rapidly. Climate change is warming the far north faster than almost anywhere else on Earth. Sea ice is melting, permafrost is thawing, animal populations are shifting. These changes pose new challenges for Arctic peoples, threatening traditional ways of life. Hunters who once travelled on sea ice that was thick and predictable now face thin ice that breaks unpredictably. Animals that once were reliable are now scarce or appearing in new areas. Traditional knowledge about weather and ice is becoming less reliable as the climate shifts. Buildings built on permafrost are sinking as the ground thaws beneath them, but Arctic peoples are adapting, as they have always adapted. They are incorporating new knowledge while maintaining their connection to the land. They are becoming voices in the global conversation about climate change, advocating for action, sharing their observations of how the Arctic is changing. They are the witnesses to one of the most dramatic environmental changes in human history, and their testimony is invaluable. As we drift towards sleep, let us think about what the civilizations of the North Pole can teach us. They teach us about resilience, about how humans can thrive in the most extreme environments through ingenuity and cooperation. They teach us about sustainability, about living within the limits of what the land can provide. They teach us about patience, about paying attention, about respecting the world around us. These are lessons that are relevant far beyond the Arctic. In a world facing climate change, resource depletion, and social fragmentation, the wisdom of Arctic peoples offers valuable insights. How do we live with less? How do we build communities that support all their members? How do we maintain hope in difficult circumstances? The answer lies partly in the past, in the knowledge accumulated by peoples who have faced these challenges for millennia. But it also lies in the present, in the ongoing efforts of Arctic peoples to maintain their cultures while adapting to a changing world. They are not museum pieces, frozen in the past, but living peoples with agency and vision, working to create futures that honour their ancestors while embracing change. Let your mind wander now across the frozen landscape. Picture the aurora dancing overhead, waves of green and purple light rippling across the sky. Picture a snow house glowing softly from the lamp inside, smoke rising from the vent hole. Picture a hunter on the ice, patient and still, waiting. Picture a child learning to sew, carefully placing each stitch under a grandmother's watchful eye. Picture a drum echoing across the tundra, calling the spirits. These images are not just romantic fantasies, they are snapshots of real life, past and present. People really did live this way. People still do, though the details have changed. The Arctic is not empty. It has never been empty. It has been home for as long as humans have existed in their current form, and it will remain home as long as there are people who love it. The story of the Arctic is ultimately a human story. It is about courage and endurance, about love and loss, about the need for meaning and connection. It is about how people create culture and beauty, even in the harshest circumstances. It is about how knowledge is accumulated and transmitted across generations. It is about how communities support each other through difficulty. As you settle deeper into sleep, let these stories accompany you. Let them remind you of human capacity for adaptation, for creativity, for kindness. Let them remind you that there are many ways to be human, many ways to live a good life. The way of life developed in the Arctic is one among many, but it has much to teach us about what is truly essential. The people of the Arctic lived close to the edge of survival, but they did not live in fear. They lived with purpose, with meaning, with connection to each other and to the land. They understood that life was precious because it was fragile. They understood that community was essential because individuals were vulnerable. They understood that respect for the world around them was not optional, but necessary. In our modern world, insulated from nature, surrounded by technology, living in cities of millions, we have lost some of this understanding. We have gained much, but we have also lost much. The Arctic peoples remind us of what we have lost and show us that it is possible to live differently, to value different things, to find happiness and meaning without material abundance. This is not to romanticize poverty or hardship. Life in the Arctic was often difficult. People died young. Hunger was a real threat. Accidents were common. But within these limitations, people created lives that were rich and full. They had art and music and stories. They had love and friendship and community. They had purpose and meaning. They had connection to something larger than themselves. As the night deepens and sleep approaches, consider the vast expanse of the Arctic, the millions of square miles of tundra and ice, the islands scattered across the Arctic Ocean, the coasts where people have lived for thousands of years. This is a landscape that seems harsh and empty to outsiders, but is full of life and history to those who know it. Every place in the Arctic has a name in the indigenous languages. Every significant landmark, every good hunting spot, every dangerous place. These names carry information, encode knowledge, create a mental map that helps people navigate and survive. When you know the names, the landscape becomes familiar, comprehensible, even comfortable. Many of these names are being forgotten as languages die. A language can vanish in a single generation if children are not taught to speak it. And when a language dies, a whole way of thinking dies with it, a unique perspective on the world that can never be fully recovered. This is why language revitalization is so important to Arctic peoples. It is not just about preserving words, but about preserving worldviews, knowledge, identity. Imagine walking across the tundra in summer. The sun circles the sky, never setting, providing 24 hours of daylight. The ground is covered with low-growing plants, many of them blooming. The air is filled with the sound of birds. This is the brief season of abundance, when life explodes across the landscape, taking advantage of the short summer to reproduce. Arctic peoples moved with these seasons, following the animals, harvesting plants, fishing in the rivers. Each season had its tasks, its challenges, its pleasures. Summer was a time of intense activity, gathering and storing food for the winter. Fall was a time of preparation, making clothing, repairing tools. Winter was a time of relative rest, living off stored food, telling stories, making crafts. Spring was a time of anticipation, waiting for the ice to break, waiting for the animals to return. This seasonal rhythm structured life, gave it shape and meaning. You knew where you were in the year by what you were doing, by what the weather was like, by what animals were available. Time was not an abstract measure, but concrete, tied to natural cycles. This created a different relationship to time than most modern people have, a more relaxed, cyclical understanding rather than the linear, rushed feeling of contemporary life. In the deep winter darkness, when the sun did not rise for months, life slowed down. This was a time for stories, for crafts, for community. People gathered together for warmth and companionship. Children learned from elders. Songs were sung. Memories were shared. This was when culture was transmitted, when the next generation learned what it meant to be part of the community. The stories told during these long winter nights were not just entertainment, though they were certainly that. They were also education, moral instruction, history, and spiritual teaching all wrapped together. A story about a hunter who violated a taboo and suffered consequences taught about the rules that needed to be followed. A story about ancestors who survived a terrible winter taught resilience and hope. A story about encounters with spirits taught about the nature of reality. These stories were refined over countless tellings, shaped to be memorable, to capture attention, to convey their lessons clearly. They used repetition, rhyme, drama, humour, whatever would make them stick in the mind. And they worked. People remembered these stories their whole lives, remembered the lessons they taught, passed them on to their own children and grandchildren. This oral tradition is ancient, far older than writing. It is how humans transmitted knowledge for most of our existence as a species. Writing is a recent invention, only a few thousand years old, and it has advantages and disadvantages compared to oral tradition. Writing can preserve information exactly, but it is passive, requiring someone to actively seek out and read the text. Oral tradition is active, living, performed, changing slightly with each telling but maintaining core truths. In the Arctic, both traditions now coexist. People still tell stories, but they also write them down, record them, share them in new ways. This creates opportunities for preservation but also challenges to authenticity. When a story is written down, it becomes fixed, losing the flexibility of oral performance. When a story is recorded and shared online, it reaches a wider audience but may be removed from its cultural context. These are the challenges of cultural survival in the modern world. How do you preserve tradition while adapting to change? How do you maintain identity while engaging with global culture? How do you honour the past while creating a future? These are questions that Arctic peoples are grappling with, questions that indigenous peoples around the world are grappling with. There are no easy answers. Different communities make different choices. Some embrace modernity while maintaining cultural practices. Some try to maintain traditional lifestyles as much as possible. Some blend old and new in creative ways. What matters is that the choices are made by the communities themselves, not imposed from outside. For too long, outsiders tried to force Arctic peoples to abandon their cultures, to become like Europeans or Russians or Canadians or Americans. This caused immense damage, trauma that still echoes through communities today. The recognition that this was wrong, that cultural diversity has value, that indigenous peoples have rights, is relatively recent and still incomplete. But progress is being made. Indigenous rights are increasingly recognised in international law. Self-governance is expanding in many Arctic regions. Languages and cultural practices are being revitalised. Young people are reconnecting with their heritage while also engaging with the modern world on their own terms. As you drift deeper into sleep, let your mind rest on these themes: the resilience of cultures, the importance of knowledge, the value of community, the the beauty of adaptation, the dignity of all peoples, the interconnectedness of humanity and nature. The civilizations of the North Pole are not forgotten. Not really. They live on in the people who descend from them, in the languages still spoken, in the stories still told, in the skills still practiced. They live on in the archaeological remains scattered across the Arctic, waiting to tell their stories to those who know how to listen. They live on in the land itself, shaped by thousands of years of human presence, and they live on in the lessons they offer, lessons about how to live well with limited resources, how to find joy in harsh circumstances, how to maintain community in isolation, how to respect the world around us. These lessons are more relevant now than ever, as humanity faces global challenges that require cooperation, resilience and wisdom. The Arctic is often seen as remote, irrelevant to most people's lives. But what happens in the Arctic affects the entire world. The ice and snow of the Arctic reflect sunlight, helping to regulate global temperature. The thawing of Arctic permafrost releases greenhouse gases that accelerate climate change. The loss of Arctic ice affects ocean currents that shape weather patterns worldwide. The Arctic is not separate from the rest of the world, but deeply connected to it. Similarly, the peoples of the Arctic are not separate from the rest of humanity, but part of our shared story. Their ancestors were among the most adventurous, adaptable people ever to live, pushing into environments that seemed impossible for human habitation, and not just surviving, but thriving. They developed technologies, cultures, and knowledge that deserve to be celebrated and preserved, not as museum curiosities, but as living traditions with continuing relevance. In the silence of the Arctic night, under the aurora's glow, the old stories are still told, the old songs are still sung, the old ways are still practiced, adapted perhaps, changed certainly, but continuous with the past. This continuity is precious, a thread connecting present to past, a reminder that we are part of something larger than ourselves. As sleep overtakes you, imagine yourself standing on the ice, looking up at the stars. The Milky Way stretches across the sky, brighter than you have ever seen it, unobscured by light pollution. The stars wheel slowly overhead, the same stars that guided Arctic navigators for thousands of years. The cold is intense, but you are warm in your carefully sewn clothing, comfortable despite the temperature. Around you is silence, profound and complete. The kind of silence that only exists far from human civilization, far from machines and traffic and the constant background noise of modern life. In this silence, you can hear your own breathing, your own heartbeat. You can hear the subtle sounds of the ice, creaking and groaning as it shifts. You can hear, far in the distance, the howl of a wolf. This is a primal experience, the kind of experience that shaped human consciousness for most of our existence as a species. For almost all of human history, this is what nighttime was like. Dark, quiet, full of stars, full of potential danger, but also full of beauty. We have lost this in our modern, lit-up, noisy world, but it still exists in places like the Arctic. The peoples of the Arctic maintained this connection to the primordial world even as other humans moved into cities and created technological civilization. They did not do this because they were backward or primitive as outsiders once thought, but because they had adapted so well to their environment that change was unnecessary. Their way of life worked. It was sustainable, resilient, meaningful. Now, as that way of life changes, as the Arctic itself changes, there is a poignant quality to remembering what was. Not nostalgia exactly, but a recognition that something valuable is being lost, that the world is becoming more uniform, that diversity is declining. But there is also hope. Hope that the essential wisdom will survive, that the core values will endure, that future generations will find ways to honour the past while creating new ways of being. The Arctic winter night stretches on, endless and peaceful. The stars turn slowly overhead. The aurora flickers and dances, curtains of light in green and purple and red, mysterious and beautiful. Scientists now know that the aurora is caused by solar particles interacting with the Earth's magnetic field, but this knowledge does not diminish the beauty or the wonder. The aurora remains magical, a gift from the cosmos, a reminder that we live in a vast and mysterious universe. Arctic peoples had their own explanations for the aurora. Some said it was the spirits of the dead playing ball with a walrus skull. Some said it was the torch of a spirit helping late travellers find their way home. Some said it was a pathway to the sky world. These explanations are different from the scientific explanation, but they are not less valid. They capture something that science misses: the emotional and spiritual impact of the phenomenon. This is one of the strengths of indigenous knowledge systems. They integrate the practical and the spiritual, the factual and the meaningful. They do not separate the world into different categories the way Western science does, but see everything as interconnected, part of a living whole. This holistic worldview has much to offer, especially as we recognise the limitations of approaching the world in a purely reductionist, materialistic way. Let us journey deeper into the Arctic experience, deeper into the understanding of what it meant to live at the top of the world. Consider the daily life of a family in an ancient Arctic settlement 1,000 years ago, before any contact with the outside world. The rhythm of their days was dictated by the sun, or its absence, and by the needs of survival. Wake in the morning, though morning is a relative term when the sun does not rise, to the sound of your breath condensing in the cold air of the dwelling. The seal oil lamp has burned low through the night, and the house has grown cold, though not as cold as outside where the temperature has dropped to 50 below zero. Someone rises first, usually the eldest woman of the household, and tends to the lamp, adding more oil, adjusting the wick until the flame grows brighter and warmth begins to spread through the space. The house is small, perhaps 15 feet across, built partially underground for insulation. The walls are made of stone and whalebone, the largest bones from hunts that took place years ago, standing upright like pillars holding up the roof. The roof itself is made of more bones, covered with layers of sealskin and then buried under sod. Snow has drifted over the top, adding another layer of insulation. Inside, the walls are lined with skins hung to keep the cold stone from drawing heat from the air. The sleeping platform runs along one wall, raised above the floor where the coldest air settles. More skins serve as bedding, caribou hides with the fur turned inward for warmth. The family sleeps together, parents and children, grandparents if they are still living, sometimes other relatives. Body heat shared is warmth preserved. In the coldest part of winter, even the dogs might be brought inside, their warmth and presence a comfort against the darkness. The day's first task is always food. The children are sent to the food cache, a structure built outside from stones to retrieve frozen meat. Perhaps seal, killed a week ago and frozen solid within hours of being butchered. The meat is brought inside and placed near the lamp to thaw slightly, enough that it can be cut and eaten. Some of it will be cooked over the lamp, the fat sputtering and dripping, filling the house with the smell of cooking meat. Some will be eaten raw, frozen, a delicacy, and actually easier to digest, the cold meat requiring less water to process than cooked meat, an important consideration when fresh water must be obtained by melting snow or ice. After eating, the work of the day begins. For the men, this might mean preparing hunting equipment, checking the condition of harpoons and lines, sharpening knives made from bone or stone, or it might mean going out onto the ice to hunt, a task that requires careful preparation. Clothing must be checked. Any tear or gap could let in the cold, leading to frostbite or worse. The dogs must be harnessed if they are being taken, a process that can take an hour or more with a full team. Food must be packed, enough for several days if the hunting takes the men far from home. For the women, the work is equally demanding. Clothing is always being made or repaired. A single parka might require the skins of multiple caribou, carefully selected and prepared. The skins must be scraped clean of fat and tissue, a process that takes hours of careful work. They must be softened by chewing or by working them with a scraping tool, made supple enough to sew. The sewing itself is meticulous work, each stitch placed carefully, the sinew thread pulled tight. A poorly sewn garment could mean death, so the work is done with absolute attention to detail. The women also process the food, cutting meat into strips for drying, rendering fat into oil for the lamps, cleaning and preparing skins, tending to the children, keeping the house in order. It is ceaseless work, but it is also social. Women often work together, talking and singing, teaching the younger women and girls the skills they need to survive. This is where knowledge is transmitted, where stories are told, where the culture is maintained. Children in Arctic societies had their own world, their own games and activities, but they also learned by watching and imitating. A young boy might be given a small harpoon, carefully made by his father, and taught to throw it at a target. A young girl might be given sewing materials and taught to make simple items, gradually working up to more complex garments. Children learned by doing, by making mistakes in low-stakes situations, so that when survival depended on their skills, they would be ready. Play was not separate from work, but blended with it. Children might play at hunting, stalking imaginary seals across the ice. They might play at building snow houses, creating miniature versions of the real structures. They might play games that taught hand-eye coordination, strength, endurance, all skills that would be necessary in adulthood. But they were also given time to simply be children, to laugh and run and explore, to develop the creativity and problem-solving skills that would serve them throughout their lives. The elderly were respected and cared for, their knowledge valued even when their bodies could no longer perform hard physical labour. An elder might spend their days carving, creating beautiful objects from ivory or bone. They might repair tools, a task that required skill but not strength. Most importantly, they told stories, preserving the history and knowledge of the people, teaching the young ones about the land and the animals and the spirits. As the day progresses, the light outside barely changes. In the deep winter, the sun never rises, leaving the world in a perpetual twilight. The sky might lighten slightly at midday, a faint glow on the southern horizon, but true daylight does not come. This darkness could be oppressive, leading to what we now call seasonal affective disorder, but Arctic peoples developed strategies for coping. The seal oil lamps provided light inside the houses. Social gatherings brought people together. Stories and games and music filled the long hours of darkness. The aurora borealis provided its own light, spectacular and unpredictable. When it appeared, people might go outside to watch, standing in the cold to witness the display. The lights moved across the sky in waves and curtains, sometimes so bright they cast shadows on the snow. The colours ranged from pale green to deep red, sometimes with streaks of purple or blue. For people who lived with darkness most of the year, the aurora was a gift, a reminder that even in the darkest times there could be beauty and wonder. Hunting in the winter darkness was challenging but necessary. Seals had to be hunted at their breathing holes, places where they came up through the ice to breathe. A hunter might locate a breathing hole by the slight dome of frost that formed around it from the seal's breath. He would then wait, sometimes for hours, standing perfectly still in the freezing cold, his harpoon ready. The slightest movement or sound would alert the seal, and it would not surface. Patience was essential. When the seal finally did surface, the hunter had only a moment to strike. The harpoon had to penetrate the breathing hole, through perhaps several feet of ice, and strike the seal below. If the strike was successful, the line attached to the harpoon would prevent the seal from sinking or swimming away. This type of hunting required incredible skill and endurance. The hunter had to read the ice, understanding where seals were likely to have breathing holes. He had to be able to stand motionless for hours in temperatures that would kill an unprepared person in minutes. He had to strike accurately and quickly when the opportunity came, and he had to do all this in near total darkness, often with only the stars and perhaps the aurora for light. When a seal was caught, it was cause for celebration, but also for reverence. The seal had given its life so that the people could live. This was not taken lightly. The hunter would perform rituals, speaking to the spirit of the seal, thanking it for its sacrifice. The seal would be butchered carefully, every part used. The meat would feed the community. The blubber would provide fuel for lamps and food rich in calories. The skin would be used for clothing or for boat coverings. The bones might be used for tools or for construction. Nothing was wasted because waste was disrespectful to the animal's sacrifice. In the brief summer, life was entirely different. The sun never set, circling the sky 24 hours a day. The ice broke up, creating leads and channels of open water. The tundra, frozen solid for most of the year, thawed on the surface, creating a landscape of small lakes and marshes. Plants grew rapidly, taking advantage of the short growing season. Insects emerged in tremendous numbers, clouds of mosquitoes and black flies that could drive both people and animals to distraction. Summer was a time of abundance, but also of intense activity. This was when food had to be gathered and stored for the coming winter. Caribou hunted during their migrations could be preserved by drying the meat. Fish could be caught in large numbers and dried or cached in the permafrost. Birds nested on the cliffs and their eggs could be gathered. Plants could be harvested. berries and roots that would supplement the meat-heavy diet of winter. The coastal peoples would hunt walruses and seals on the ice floes. The boats, which had been stored for the winter, would be brought out, repaired, and launched. Umiak and kayak expeditions might last for days or weeks, the hunters travelling far from home in search of game. The women and children might move to summer camps, places where fish were plentiful or where specific plants could be gathered. This seasonal movement was part of the rhythm of life. People did not stay in one place year-round, but moved across the landscape, following the resources, always planning ahead, always thinking about what would be needed in the next season. This required intimate knowledge of the land passed down through generations. Where were the best fishing spots? When did the caribou migrate through a particular valley? Where could you find specific types of stone for making tools? All of this knowledge was stored in memory, encoded in stories, marked on the land itself in ways that outsiders might never notice. The landscape was full of meaning to Arctic peoples. A particular mountain might be the home of a spirit. A lake might be where a legendary hunter once camped. A rock formation might mark the boundary between territories. These were not abstract concepts, but practical information, ways of organising knowledge about the world, ways of remembering important details. European explorers, encountering this landscape, saw only emptiness. They drew maps that showed vast blank spaces, labelled unexplored or simply left unmarked. But to the indigenous peoples there were no blank spaces. Every place had a name, a history, a significance. The land was full, rich with meaning and memory, anything but empty. This disconnect between indigenous and Western ways of understanding the land continues to this day. When outsiders look at the Arctic, they often see resources to be extracted. Oil, minerals, shipping routes. When indigenous peoples look at the same landscape, they see home. They see the graves of their ancestors. They see sacred sites. They see the places where food is gathered. They see a living landscape that sustains them. These different ways of seeing lead to conflict, as they have for centuries. The imposition of Western political structures onto the Arctic has been particularly disruptive. Borders were drawn by distant governments, often cutting through traditional territories. A people who had moved freely across a region for thousands of years suddenly found themselves divided by a national boundary. Families were separated, traditional hunting routes were interrupted. The very concept of borders, of lines on a map that determined where you could and could not go, was foreign to people who had organised space through usage and tradition, rather than through exclusive ownership. The colonial period brought tremendous changes and tremendous suffering to Arctic peoples. Diseases introduced by Europeans, influenza, smallpox, measles, swept through communities that had no immunity. Entire villages were wiped out. Populations that had been stable for thousands of years crashed. The survivors were left traumatised, their social structures disrupted, their elders dead, their knowledge disappearing. The fur trade disrupted traditional economies. Arctic peoples had always traded, but within their own networks, exchanging goods and knowledge with neighbouring groups. The fur trade brought them into a global economy, one they had little control over. Suddenly, the value of furs was determined by markets thousands of miles away. The price might be high one year and collapse the next, leaving hunters who had spent months trapping with goods they could not sell. The trade also brought dependency. Metal tools, guns, tea, flour, sugar. These goods became necessities, replacing traditional items, but they required continued participation in the trade to acquire, tying people into an economic system that could be exploited by traders and government alike. Christian missionaries arrived, determined to convert the heathen peoples of the north. Traditional spiritual practices were condemned as devil worship. Shamans were persecuted, their drums burned, their practices outlawed. Children were taught that their ancestors' beliefs were wrong, that the spirits they had been taught to respect did not exist, that the ceremonies that had structured life for generations were sinful. This spiritual assault was deeply damaging, cutting people off from their traditions, creating shame about their own culture. Perhaps most damaging were the residential schools, a policy pursued by multiple governments in the Arctic regions. Children were taken from their families, sometimes by force, and sent to schools far from home. There they were forbidden to speak their own languages, forced to adopt European dress and customs, often abused physically, emotionally, and sexually. The stated goal was to kill the Indian in the child, to erase indigenous identity and replace it with European identity. The policy was a form of cultural genocide, intended to destroy indigenous cultures by targeting children, the next generation who would carry on traditions. The effects of residential schools continue to reverberate through Arctic communities today. Languages were lost as children grew up unable to speak to their grandparents. Traditional knowledge was not passed down because the children were not there to learn it. Families were fractured, children returning home as strangers to their own culture, traumatized and often unable to form healthy relationships or parent their own children. This cycle of trauma has continued through generations, manifesting as substance abuse, domestic violence, suicide rates far above national averages. But even in the face of all this, Arctic peoples have survived. They have maintained their identities, adapted to the new world while holding on to what is essential from the old. The resilience shown by Arctic peoples in the face of colonization, cultural suppression, and environmental change is remarkable. It speaks to the strength of their cultures, the depth of their connection to the land, the power of community and tradition. In recent decades, there has been a growing movement for indigenous rights, for recognition and respect for indigenous cultures. International bodies like the United Nations have recognized indigenous rights, including rights to self-determination, to their lands and resources, to maintain and develop their cultures and languages. While implementation of these rights is far from perfect, the recognition itself represents progress. Across the Arctic, indigenous governments are taking greater control over their own affairs. Inuit organizations in Canada, Alaska, and Greenland have negotiated land claim settlements that give them control over vast territories. Sami parliaments in Norway, Sweden, and Finland give Sami people a voice in policies that affect them. Indigenous peoples are asserting their rights to be consulted on resource extraction, on environmental protection, on education and cultural policies. There is a renaissance of indigenous culture happening across the Arctic. Languages that were on the verge of extinction are being taught to new generations. Schools are incorporating traditional knowledge alongside Western curricula. Artists are creating new works that draw on traditional forms and themes. Writers are publishing in indigenous languages, creating literature where oral tradition once dominated. Musicians are blending traditional sounds with contemporary styles, creating new forms of expression that honour the past while engaging with the present. This cultural revival is not about returning to an idealised past. No one wants to give up modern medicine, modern communications, modern conveniences, but there is a recognition that culture provides identity, meaning, connection, that the knowledge developed over thousands of years has value, that languages are treasures, each one a unique way of understanding and describing the world, that stories and songs and ceremonies connect people to their ancestors and to their land in ways that are irreplaceable. Young people are particularly important in this revival. They are learning from elders while also bringing new ideas and new energy. They are using social media to share their cultures, to connect with indigenous youth around the world, to challenge stereotypes and assert their presence. They are becoming lawyers and doctors and teachers and politicians, taking positions of influence and using them to advocate for their communities. They are hunters and artists and language teachers, keeping traditional practices alive while adapting them for the modern world. The Arctic is also seeing increasing interest from outsiders, both positive and negative. Scientists recognise the Arctic as a crucial region for understanding climate change. The rapid warming of the Arctic, the melting of ice, the thawing of permafrost, these changes have global implications. Arctic indigenous peoples are valuable partners in this research. Their observations of environmental change providing data that goes back generations, their traditional ecological knowledge complementing scientific understanding. At the same time, the melting of Arctic ice is opening up new shipping routes and making resource extraction easier. Governments and corporations are eyeing Arctic oil, gas, and minerals. There is pressure to develop the region, to exploit its resources, often with little regard for the impact on indigenous peoples or on the environment. Arctic peoples are fighting to ensure their voices are heard in these decisions, that development, if it happens, is done sustainably and with their consent. Tourism is also increasing in the Arctic. People from warmer climates are drawn to the exotic beauty of the far north, to see polar bears and icebergs, to experience the midnight sun or the northern lights. This brings economic opportunities for Arctic communities, but also challenges. How do you share your culture with visitors without commodifying it? How do you balance the economic benefits of tourism with the need to protect sensitive sites and maintain privacy? These are questions Arctic communities are grappling with. Climate change is perhaps the greatest challenge facing the Arctic today. The region is warming at more than twice the global average rate. Sea ice is declining rapidly. Permafrost is thawing, releasing greenhouse gases and destabilizing the ground. Coastlines are eroding as the sea ice that once protected them disappears. Animal populations are shifting, with some species declining and others expanding their ranges northward. For Arctic peoples, these changes are not abstract scientific data, but lived reality. Hunters who once could predict ice conditions with confidence now find the ice unpredictable and dangerous. Thin ice where there should be thick ice. Open water where there should be solid ice. Buildings and infrastructure built on permafrost are sinking as the ground thaws. Traditional foods are becoming harder to find. The land is changing in ways that make traditional knowledge less reliable, creating uncertainty and risk. But Arctic peoples are not passive victims of climate change. They are documenting the changes they observe, contributing to scientific understanding. They are adapting their practices, developing new knowledge to deal with new conditions. They are advocating for climate action, demanding that the world address the problem that is so dramatically affecting their homelands. Arctic indigenous voices are increasingly heard at international climate negotiations, insisting that those who contributed least to the problem should not be the ones who suffer most from its effects. As we move deeper into the night, deeper into sleep, let us consider what is at stake in the Arctic. It is not just ice and polar bears, though these are important. It is not just a canary in the coal, mine for global climate change, though it is certainly that. It is also home to hundreds of thousands of people, peoples with ancient cultures and deep knowledge, peoples with as much right to their homelands as anyone anywhere. The story of Arctic civilizations is a story of human ingenuity and resilience. It is a story of peoples who looked at one of the harshest environments on Earth and said, "We can live here. We can not just survive, but thrive. We can create beauty and meaning and joy even in conditions that would kill most humans." And they did. For thousands of years they did. This achievement deserves recognition and respect. The technologies developed by Arctic peoples, the clothing, the boats, the hunting implements, the shelters, represent solutions to extreme problems, refined over countless generations. The social structures they developed, egalitarian, cooperative, emphasizing sharing and mutual support, represent successful strategies for survival in challenging conditions. The spiritual and philosophical systems they developed, seeing the world as alive and interconnected, emphasizing respect and reciprocity, offer wisdom that our modern world desperately needs. As sleep deepens, imagine the sweep of Arctic history. Picture the first peoples arriving, perhaps following game across the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age. Picture them spreading eastward across the Arctic, adapting to each new environment, developing new strategies, new technologies. Picture thousands of years of life on the ice, of hunting and gathering, of births and deaths, of stories told and songs sung. Picture the moment when a Norse ship first appeared on the horizon, strange and frightening to people who had never seen Europeans. Picture the first encounters, the confusion and curiosity on both sides. Picture the slow encroachment of the outside world, bringing both opportunities and threats. Picture the residential schools, the trauma inflicted on children torn from their families. Picture the resilience of peoples who refused to disappear, who maintained their identities through the worst that could be thrown at them. Picture the Arctic today, a place of contrasts, traditional hunting camps and modern towns, elders speaking languages thousands of years old and youth connected to the world through the internet, ceremonies that go back to time immemorial and contemporary political movements fighting for indigenous rights, a landscape that looks timeless but is changing rapidly due to forces originating far away. The Arctic night stretches on, vast and quiet. The stars wheel overhead, the same stars that have watched over the Arctic for all of human history. The constellations that Arctic peoples used for navigation, the stories they told about the stars, connecting the sky to the earth, making sense of the cosmos in human terms. In a traditional story told by many Arctic peoples, there was a time when animals and humans spoke the same language, when the boundaries between them were fluid. A person might become an animal might become a person. This was not seen as strange, but as natural, a recognition that all beings shared a common nature, that the differences between species were not as great as they might appear. This story reflects a worldview that modern science is in some ways coming back to. We now know that humans and other animals share most of our DNA. We know that many animals have complex emotions, problem-solving abilities, even cultures of their own. We know that the hard boundary between human and animal is not as clear as once thought. Arctic peoples knew this thousands of years ago, encoded it in their stories, lived it in their daily lives when they spoke to the animals they hunted, when they treated them with respect and gratitude. This respect extended to all of nature. The land was not inert matter to be exploited, but alive, conscious in its own way, deserving of respect. When you took something from the land, you gave thanks. When you used a resource, you used it carefully, making sure not to waste, not to take more than you needed. This was not just spiritual belief, but practical wisdom. In a land where resources were limited, where survival depended on the continued abundance of animals and plants, overharvesting could mean disaster. This ethic of sustainability is something the modern world is struggling to learn. We have treated the earth as an unlimited resource, taken without giving back, consumed without thinking of the consequences. Now we're facing those consequences: climate change, species extinctions, pollution, resource depletion. The wisdom of Arctic peoples and of indigenous peoples around the world offers an alternative model, one based on respect and reciprocity rather than exploitation and domination. Let your breath slow, your muscles relax. Let the images of the Arctic flow through your mind. The blue-white of ice under moonlight, the green shimmer of the aurora, the brown and gold of tundra in autumn, the endless white of the winter landscape, the dark open water of summer leads, the pink and orange of the brief Arctic sunset, the silver of starlight on snow. Let the sounds of the Arctic fill your ears. The wind, always the wind, sometimes a gentle breeze, sometimes a howling gale. The crack and groan of ice constantly moving, shifting, breaking, freezing. The calls of animals, the howl of wolves, the bark of Arctic foxes, the songs of whales, the splash of a seal surfacing, the thunder of caribou hooves during the migration, the cries of birds in their thousands during the brief summer, the profound silence of a still winter night. Let the feeling of the Arctic surround you, the cold that takes your breath away when you first step outside, the gradual warming as your body adjusts, as your clothing traps air and holds heat, the satisfaction of physical work, of muscles working hard, of accomplishing a difficult task, the comfort of warmth after cold, of coming inside to a warm house, of hot food and drink, the coziness of sleeping warm under furs while the wind howls outside, the sense of being small in a vast landscape, humbled by the scale and power of nature. And let the spirit of the Arctic peoples inspire you. Their courage in living in one of the harshest environments on Earth, their ingenuity in developing the technologies they needed to survive, their wisdom in creating cultures that were sustainable, that could last for thousands of years without depleting the resources they depended on, their artistry in creating beauty even in the midst of hardship, their humour that allowed them to laugh even in difficult circumstances, their love for their homeland, fierce and unshakable, despite all the hardships it presented. The forgotten civilizations of the North Pole are not truly forgotten. They live on in their descendants, in the ways of life that continue to be practiced, adapted certainly, changed inevitably, but rooted in thousands of years of accumulated wisdom. They live on in the archaeological record, the sites scattered across the Arctic waiting to tell their stories to those patient enough to listen. They live on in the landscape itself, shaped by generations of human presence, names carried in indigenous languages, stories embedded in specific places. And they live on in the lessons they offer to all humanity. Lessons about resilience in the face of challenge, about cooperation and community, about living in balance with nature, about finding meaning and beauty in unexpected places, about the diversity of human cultures and the many ways of being human, about respect and reciprocity, about wisdom that comes from paying attention over generations, about the strength of tradition combined with the flexibility to adapt. These lessons are needed now more than ever. As humanity faces global challenges, we need the wisdom of all our cultures, all our traditions. We need the long-term thinking of peoples who planned not just for their own generation, but for 7 generations ahead. We need the ecological wisdom of peoples who understood that human well-being and environmental health are inseparable. We need the social wisdom of peoples who created egalitarian, cooperative societies in some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. The Arctic stands at a crossroads. The old ways are fading as elders die, and climate change makes traditional practices more difficult. But new ways are emerging as young people find creative ways to honour their heritage while engaging with the modern world. Languages that were endangered are being revitalised. Cultural practices that were suppressed are being reclaimed. Political and economic power that was taken is being regained. The future of the Arctic, and of Arctic peoples, is not yet written. What happens in the Arctic matters for all of us, not just because of climate feedbacks and shipping routes and resource extraction, though these are important, but because the Arctic shows us what is possible, what humans are capable of. If people can thrive at the top of the world, in frozen darkness, with limited resources, then we can solve the problems facing us. If Arctic peoples can maintain their cultures and identities through centuries of suppression and rapid change, then cultural survival is possible even in the face of overwhelming pressure. The Arctic is a place of extremes, but it is also a place of beauty and wonder. It is a place where the northern lights dance across the sky, where the midnight sun circles the horizon without setting, where ice sculptures the landscape into fantastic forms, where silence is so profound you can hear your own heartbeat, where the stars shine with a brilliance rarely seen in our light-polluted world, where encounters with wildlife feel primal and real in ways that are hard to find elsewhere. It is a place that tests humans but also rewards them. The cold is brutal, but seeing the sun return after months of darkness is a joy that people in more temperate climates cannot fully understand. The isolation is challenging, but it creates bonds of community that are powerful and deep. The harshness makes every success sweeter, every comfort more appreciated, every moment of beauty more precious. As you drift in the borderland between waking and sleeping, let yourself imagine standing on the Arctic ice at the North Pole itself. There is no land here, only ice floating on the Arctic Ocean. The pole is marked only by GPS coordinates, by mathematics, by human concept. The ice cares nothing for this designation. It shifts and moves with currents and winds, creating and closing leads, forming pressure ridges where plates of ice collide and buckle upward. In winter, this is a place of darkness and cold beyond imagination. The temperature can drop below -60 degrees. The wind can reach hurricane force. The darkness is complete, broken only by stars and moon and aurora. This is about as far from human-friendly as Earth gets, and yet Arctic peoples have lived within a few hundred miles of this spot for thousands of years. They have crossed this ice on hunting expeditions. They have survived here, against all odds. In summer, the pole experiences continuous daylight, the sun circling endlessly above. The ice begins to melt, forming pools on the surface, creating leads of open water. Life appears, birds flying overhead, seals surfacing in the leads, even the occasional polar bear. The temperature might rise above freezing, positively balmy compared to winter. But it is still a harsh environment, still a place where mistakes can be fatal. Standing at the pole, you would be as far from civilization as you can get in the northern hemisphere. Every direction is south. The nearest land is hundreds of miles away. You're standing on ice that could be 10 feet thick or more, floating on an ocean that is thousands of feet deep. Below you is darkness and cold, and pressure that would crush a human instantly. Above you is the thin atmosphere, growing thinner as you go up, until there is nothing but the vacuum of space. This extreme environment puts human life in perspective. We are fragile beings, adapted for the warm savannas of Africa where we evolved. We have no fur, no blubber, no natural protection against extreme cold. We cannot survive in water below about 50 degrees for more than a few minutes. We need food constantly, water regularly, warmth always. By all rights, we should never have been able to survive in the Arctic, let alone thrive there. But we did, because we are not just our bodies. We are our minds, our cultures, our accumulated knowledge. We can imagine solutions to problems. We can learn from trial and error. We can pass knowledge from generation to generation, building on what came before. We can cooperate, pooling our skills and resources. These abilities allowed humans to spread across the entire planet, from equatorial rainforests to Arctic tundra, from lowland coasts to high mountain valleys. We are perhaps the most adaptable species ever to exist, and Arctic peoples represent the pinnacle of this adaptability. Think about what it took for the first people to move into the Arctic. They were coming from warmer regions, following game perhaps, or fleeing enemies, or simply exploring. They would have encountered conditions they had never experienced before. The cold would have been shocking, the darkness disorienting. Many probably died in those early attempts, but some survived. Some figured out how to make warmer clothing, better shelters, more effective hunting tools. Some observed the animals that lived in the Arctic and learned from them, how Arctic foxes survived the winter, how seals navigated the ice, how caribou found food under the snow. Over generations, over centuries, this knowledge accumulated. What worked was passed on. What didn't work was abandoned. New solutions were discovered. The technology evolved. Better needles for sewing, better designs for clothing, better materials for construction. The culture evolved. New stories explaining the Arctic environment, new spiritual practices appropriate to the new landscape, new social structures suited to Arctic conditions. By the time European explorers encountered Arctic peoples, they were no longer struggling pioneers but master residents of their environment. They had everything figured out. Their technology was perfectly adapted to their needs. Their cultures were stable and functional. Their knowledge was deep and comprehensive. In many ways, they were more successful in the Arctic than Europeans would be centuries later with all their modern technology. This success was not accidental or lucky. It was the result of thousands of years of careful observation, experimentation, and transmission of knowledge. It was the result of paying attention, of learning from mistakes, of thinking ahead. It was the result of cooperation, of sharing knowledge freely, of valuing the accumulated wisdom of the community over individual ego. These are lessons that apply far beyond the Arctic. Success in any challenging environment requires the same things: careful observation, willingness to learn and adapt, cooperation, long-term thinking, respect for accumulated knowledge. Modern society often dismisses traditional knowledge as primitive or superstitious, but this dismissal is itself ignorant. Traditional knowledge represents sophisticated understanding developed over long periods, tested against reality, refined through experience. Science and traditional knowledge are not opposites but complementary. Science provides a framework for understanding the world, a method for testing ideas, a way of systematizing knowledge. Traditional knowledge provides deep, long-term observations, holistic understanding of complex systems, practical wisdom about living in specific environments. The best approach combines both, using scientific methods to test and expand traditional knowledge, using traditional knowledge to guide scientific questions and interpret scientific results. This integration is happening increasingly in Arctic research. Scientists working on climate change, on wildlife management, on sustainable development, are partnering with indigenous communities, learning from their observations and knowledge, involving them in research design and interpretation. This partnership benefits everyone. Scientists get better data and understanding, indigenous communities get information and tools to deal with the changes affecting them, and the policies that result are more effective and more fair. As sleep deepens further, let the Arctic fade into dream. Let the images blur and shift, becoming something more than memory, something mythic and archetypal. The Arctic is a place of the imagination, where spirits walk and animals speak, where the boundaries between possible and impossible are thin. The Arctic of stories, where heroes face impossible challenges, where shamans journey to other worlds, where ancestors watch over the living. In the dreamscape of the Arctic, you are both yourself and someone else, somewhere else. You are standing on the ice under stars, but also you are the ice itself, ancient and patient. You are watching the aurora dance, but also you are part of the dance, energy made visible, spirit made light. You are hearing wolves howl, but also you are the wolf calling to the pack, claiming territory, singing for the joy of singing. You are a hunter, waiting at a breathing hole, patient and still, becoming cold itself, becoming ice. You are a child, learning to sew, each stitch a meditation, each completed piece a victory. You are an elder, telling stories by lamplight, watching young faces in the flickering glow, knowing that your words are carrying forward knowledge that must not be lost. You're a seal swimming under the ice, rising to breathe, seeing for an instant the stars above before diving back into darkness. You are the land itself, feeling the weight of ice, the flow of glaciers, the slow dance of seasons. You are stone, worn by wind and ice, shaped over millennia. You are water, frozen and flowing, vapour and ice and liquid, the same substance in different forms, adapting to conditions, always changing, always remaining. In this dream state, you understand things that cannot be put into words. You understand how everything is connected, how the tiniest action ripples outward, affecting everything else. You understand cyclical time, how things repeat but are never quite the same, how patterns persist across scales from heartbeats to ice ages. You understand reciprocity, how giving and receiving are part of the same flow, how taking without giving disrupts the balance. You understand why Arctic peoples speak to animals before killing them, why they thank plants when gathering them, why they make offerings to places of power. It is not superstition, but recognition of relationship, acknowledgement of connection, expression of respect for the web of life that sustains all beings. Everything depends on everything else. Humans depend on animals and plants. Animals depend on plants and each other. Plants depend on soil and water and sun. Soil depends on rocks and decomposition. All of it cycles energy and matter flowing through systems, nothing created or destroyed but constantly transformed. You understand why sharing is essential, not just practical, but moral. In a world where survival is uncertain, where anyone might need help at any time, hoarding creates vulnerability for everyone. If I keep more than I need and you starve, next time it might be reversed. But if we share, if we ensure everyone has enough, we all become more secure. This is not altruism, but enlightened self-interest, though over generations it becomes culture, becomes value, becomes who you are rather than just what you do. You understand patience born of necessity. In the Arctic, things cannot be rushed. Meat must freeze at its own pace. Ice must form before you can travel on it. Animals must be where they are when they are, not when you wish they were. Impatience leads to mistakes, and mistakes lead to death. Better to wait, to observe, to move when the time is right. This patience extends to all aspects of life, creating a rhythm that is slower than modern life, but also more sustainable, less stressful, more in tune with natural cycles. Deep in sleep now, you are beyond words, beyond concepts. You are just being, existing in a place where time is different, where past and present and future are all accessible, all happening at once. You see the deep past, the first people in the Arctic, tentatively exploring, learning, adapting. You see the long millennia of stable culture, people living much as their ancestors had for generations, changes happening but slowly, organically. You see the collision with the outside world, the trauma and disruption, but also the resilience and adaptation. You see possible futures. In one, Arctic peoples fade away, their cultures lost, their knowledge gone, the Arctic becoming just another place of resource extraction and environmental degradation. In another, there is renewal, cultural revival, sustainable development that respects both people and environment. In another, climate change transforms the Arctic so dramatically that all bets are off, everyone struggling to adapt to conditions no one has seen before. Which future comes to pass is not predetermined. It depends on choices being made now, by Arctic peoples and by the rest of humanity. It depends on whether we learn the lessons the Arctic has to teach, whether we recognise the value of cultural diversity, whether we act on climate change, whether we choose cooperation over competition, sustainability over short-term profit, wisdom over expedience. But these thoughts are too heavy for deep sleep. Let them go. Let everything go. Let yourself simply rest in the Arctic night, cradled by ice and darkness, warmed by the memory of lamplight and community, soothed by the silence and the stars. Let the forgotten civilizations of the North Pole become part of your dreams, their stories weaving through your sleep, their wisdom seeping into your unconscious mind. Rest now in the knowledge that somewhere, right now, people are living in the Arctic. Children are learning from elders, hunters are on the ice, artists are creating, activists are fighting for their rights. Communities are gathering for feasts and celebrations. Languages are being spoken that have been spoken for thousands of years. The connection continues. The cultures persist. The story is not over. Sleep deeply, peacefully. Let the frozen north hold you in its ancient embrace. Let the stars wheel overhead, marking time in ways that transcend human urgency. Let the aurora dance, mysterious and beautiful, a reminder that the universe is larger and stranger than we can fully comprehend. Let the ice speak its slow truths about patience and persistence. Let the wind sing its songs of change and adaptation. And when you wake, carry something of the Arctic with you. Carry its lessons about resilience, about community, about sustainability, about respect for nature. Carry its beauty, its strange and otherworldly landscapes, its impossible conditions where life persists anyway. Carry its peoples, their histories and struggles, their knowledge and creativity, their humanity in the face of challenges that would break lesser spirits. The civilizations of the North Pole are not forgotten. They are here, in stories and memories, in artifacts and traditions, in the people who carry on despite everything. They are in the ice itself, which remembers everything, which holds history in its frozen layers. They are in the land, shaped by millennia of human presence. They are in the future, waiting to be, created by those who honour the past while building something new. Sleep now, dream of ice and stars, dream of ancient peoples in a timeless land, dream of survival against impossible odds, dream of beauty born of hardship, dream of connections that span generations and cultures, dream of the top of the world, where human spirit meets frozen wilderness and creates something extraordinary. Dream and rest, and know that the stories continue, the ice endures, and the Arctic night holds all of us in its vast patient embrace. The forgotten civilizations of the North Pole remember themselves. In every story told, in every skill practiced, in every child who learns the old words, in every person who stands on the ice and knows they are home, in all of this, the ancient past lives on into the present, carrying forward toward futures yet unknown. Sleep and be part of that continuation, that eternal story of humans and the far north, intertwined since time began, stretching forward to time's end. Rest well, dreamer. The Arctic watches over your sleep, as it has watched over sleepers for thousands of years, patient and eternal, cold and beautiful, harsh and welcoming, forever the crown of our world, forever home to those who know its secrets, forever a teacher to those willing to learn. Good night.